All right. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be talking about informative writing. The reason that I have you guys do this is before you do your argument with research is because I like to do a thing called laddering skills, like that. So we kind of start here at the bottom with your writing sample. And then we talk about rhetoric and how people argue. Then we're right here in the ladder, and I want to really concentrate this time on incorporating sources before we get into doing the actual argument writing, which will be next. And then last, I have you do an argument with research that you find. So in that way, you understand the principles of research and how people write and why people write. Then you learn how to use research. Then you learn how to argue. And then you kind of put this and this together for your final project. And that's basically why I do what I do in this order that I do it, just in case you were wondering. So I wanted to talk about what an informative essay is. An informative essay has a different purpose than an argument. An argument, sometimes people get that confused too, but if you watched the videos on rhetoric, argument is just another word for persuade. You're trying to persuade people to think, do, believe something. An informative essay is not meant to persuade. It's really meant to teach. So it's teaching people about a particular topic. So some of the topics I pick are things that really don't have anything controversial about them. In the past, I've done things like opioids, which is we're going to look at some of the essays that I got from students, their original ones and their revision as examples. I've done in the past learning disabilities, just to explain what those are, eating disorders. I think this time we might be looking at domestic violence, but I haven't really made up my mind yet. But things that have different components to them, but don't necessarily have like a debate going on, right? Things that are interesting, but without debate. So you can learn about it, and then you can write an essay that teaches me and teaches some of your peers about it as well. Unlike an argument, in an informative essay, evidence is really going to be a lot more balanced, so a lot less biased. And there's going to be more logos than ethos or pathos. So we talked about that before. These are appeals to logic. These are appeals to our morals and our ethics. These are appeals to our emotion. You're not going to have as much appeal to ethics or appeal to emotion in an informative essay because really you're just giving people information. So your tone is going to be a lot more neutral because you're trying to give facts and information in an unbiased manner. As a writer, you have to take the role of being an expert, and this is really key to an informative essay. So make sure too that you watch the videos where I talk about the library databases and how to find really well-researched articles, because doing your research is key to this essay. And I don't talk as much about research here. I really talk more about how to structure an informative essay to make you seem like an expert and to keep your reader interested. The other reason that I talk about informative essays, besides just laddering the skills for this class, is that in a lot of your other classes, you're going to have to write informative reports. So for a class like history or science, you have to do this. And college composition is really there to support you in the rest of your college career to help you be more successful. So sometimes people, I have found, either really succeed in informative writing and they're great at being unbiased, or they really want to argue, give their opinion, back their opinion up with facts, and they do great at persuasion. So just to explain a little bit about the difference, we're going to look at some informative statements and then look at those same informative statements with a little bias to them, a little twist to them that makes them more persuasive. So, statement number one. While men have been known to abuse their wives and girlfriends, women have also been known to abuse their husbands and boyfriends. Oh, I don't know if you can see the whole thing here. Hang on just a second. Okay, we're kind of having a technical problem where some of the words are getting cut off, but I can't really fix that. So just to continue. A persuasive statement takes that same information and puts a little bit of a twist on it. So women have also been known to abuse their husbands and boyfriends. That's just a statement of fact. That has happened. Here's the persuasive part. There are plenty of programs for women and children to leave violent situations. But there need to be more programs supporting men who leave violent relationships. So you can see that loaded term, plenty. He's not just saying there are some programs for men and women, for women and children to leave violent situations. Instead, he's making an argument. There need to be more programs. Dating violence is prevalent among young people from age 12 to age 25. The number one cause of death for young people from 12 to 25 is being killed by their girlfriend or boyfriend. Now, these are from student papers, and I would say there's a lot of wordiness there that we could cut out, but it's an informative statement. Here's the informative statement turned into a persuasive one. Dating violence is prevalent among young people from age of 12 to 25. The number one cause of death is being killed by their girlfriend or boyfriend. This statistic is horrifying. Programs in high schools and colleges should prevent this violence and do more to prevent these murders from occurring. So what do we have here? We've emotionally charged language with the word horrify. We have the word should, which indicates that this writer wants high schools and colleges to do something. He's trying to persuade them to take action. Same-sex domestic violence is on the rise. Persuasive. Same-sex domestic violence carries a stigma among law enforcement individuals. So while it is on the rise, not enough is being done to support victims of same-sex violence. Okay, so not enough is being done. He is making a claim. Not enough is being done indicates that he's going to try to persuade people to do something. So let's take another example from a different paper. Informative statements versus persuasive statements. Opioids are a class of drugs that include the illicit drug heroin as well as the licit prescription pain relievers oxycodone, hydrocodone, codeine, morphine, fentanyl, and others. This is just giving me a fact. It's just telling me what kind of drugs opioids are. Persuasive statements. Opioids include both heroin and prescription pain relievers. The overprescribing of pain relievers such as oxycodone has led to the heroin crisis facing the United States. It's a really good persuasive statement, not something that should be in an informative essay, which it originally was. So the thing is that sometimes for persuasive essays, people think that they need to just make a claim, have one side or the other, say, hey, you need to believe something, you need to do something. But sometimes a persuasive paper can be persuading someone that one thing causes another thing. Sometimes a persuasive paper can be saying, hey, these two things are alike. I'm going to compare them. These two things are not alike. They have contrasts. It really depends on what the person's purpose is for writing. Let's look at another informative statement that had too much persuasiveness originally. Drug overdose is the number one cause of accidental deaths in the United States. Originally, the person had education programs focus on Just Say No campaigns to fight drug overdose, but programs should look at what causes people to use these drugs in the first place and provide therapy for people who have been abused and who experience trauma and depression. Now, this is not, again, it's not a bad statement, but if you were informing me, you would at least take out that word should. Drug programs focus on, some programs look at what causes, that kind of thing. But you need to, when you're doing informative writing, not have those loaded terms there, like should or need to. Opioid addiction is driving this epidemic, with 20,101 overdose deaths related to prescription pain relievers and 12,990 deaths related to heroin in 2015. Opioid addiction is a major problem in our country. And then she gives the statistic, 12,990 people died from heroin in 2015 alone. Now, it doesn't maybe seem like an argument, but using those loaded terms like major and 2015 alone makes it seem like she is a little bit more argumentative than just giving me the facts. So that's something to think about when you're writing. Make sure in this essay that you keep some of those loaded terms out of there. Keep the persuasive statements out, and then remember to be more persuasive when you're writing your argument paper. So, getting into the actual paper, how to structure your introduction. Begin with a hook. You can think of a hook kind of like a fish hook. A fish hook grabs a fish. A hook in your introduction should grab your reader's attention. There's my hook. And there's my little fishy. Oh, but look how happy he is. He's been hooked. So you can have an interesting example, an interesting fact, or a statistic. It is not bad here, and actually think in one of the examples, you can use first person for your hook. If you have an interesting piece of personal experience, you can use that. What I don't want you to do is use first person through the rest of your paper. This should really be an academic essay. So first person where you're saying I, me, or my really needs to be kept out of the rest of the essay. When you use I, me, and my, it becomes opinion based. So I think, I believe, in my opinion, which is not appropriate for an informative essay. It also makes it more like a conversation and not like a formal piece of writing. After you have your hook, give your thesis. Now, we're going to talk more about drafting a thesis when we get into argument and having a clear claim. Your thesis here obviously is not an argument. Instead, it should have two parts. The first part is to give your audience 1 to 2 sentence overview of your topic as a whole, so what you're going to be talking about. The second part is to give an overview of the main points. Sometimes 1 sentence, sometimes more than one. What I do not want you to have, I don't want you to have an announcement. I'll show you those in a minute. I don't want you to say, in this paper, I'm going to talk about blank, blank, blank. Why? Because it's very informal and it's really not sophisticated. So I don't want you to announce what's coming up. I want you to show me what's coming up instead of just blaring it out. The other thing I don't want you to do is I don't want you to have first person for your thesis. So don't say, I think, I believe, I am going to talk about, nothing like that. And also, in your hook, stay away from generalizations. No generalizations. Keep all those out of your paper. So, introduction, what not to do. This is from a sample student paper, not the ones that I have on Blackboard for examples for you guys, but a different one. Through all time, people in America have had problems with domestic violence. Domestic violence occurs when there is violence in a relationship. This paper will talk about the types of domestic violence: physical violence, verbal violence, and emotional violence. There are not enough programs to help people escape from domestic violence situations, but there need to be more education programs and more shelters for people who leave. Oh my goodness. So, what went wrong here? First of all, this, throughout all time, people in America. This is what I call a nothing sentence. It's not an interesting hook. It's vague and really, it's a weird stereotype. Throughout all time, so in the 1700s, did people struggle with this? Maybe, but you probably haven't talked about that in your article. So unless you're talking about domestic violence through time, keep that kind of thing out of there. Domestic violence occurs when there's violence in a relationship. Now, I don't mind if you have a definition for your article, don't have a dictionary definition. Have something in your own words. The next part of the author's thing is, a little bit better. Physical violence, verbal, and emotional. So they didn't really need that there's violence in a relationship. That's kind of clear. But I think actually what would have been more interesting, because this is so vague, what kind of relationships? Are we just talking about husband-wife, or are we talking about boyfriend-girlfriend, boyfriend-boyfriend? Could it be a parent against a child, or is that something different? Could it be a friend committing that? Is it just somebody we know, or is it a romantic relationship, right? You really need to have a little bit more specific there. I actually like the fact that they included kind of an overview of what I would assume would be in their paper, their 3 main points. The problem here is that they have an announcement. This paper will talk about. So we want to get rid of that for the revision. It's not appropriate for an academic paper, as I said before. There are not enough programs to help people. Well, this is really a persuasive statement. Saying there are not enough and what there needs to be instead, that's trying to get me to either believe that that's true or do something about it. And that's not appropriate in an informative essay. So here's the first introduction revised. Domestic violence used to be defined as a crime occurring between a husband and wife. However, according to statistics from the FBI database, the number 1 cause of death for young people ages 12 years to 25 years old is being killed by their boyfriend or girlfriend. Now, this is interesting because it does 2 things. Number 1, it kind of gives me a former definition, right? And number 2, it gives me a really interesting statistic. So it makes me want to keep reading. I'm kind of hooked. Domestic violence can be now defined, right now we're fixing the definition, as physical, verbal, and emotional violence committed against a victim's partner, friend, or family member. Since these types of crime are becoming more prevalent among teen and young adults, government programs are changing their approach dealing with domestic violence. They're being developed to help both victims and perpetrators stop the cycles of violence from continuing. Now, I have, in these last 2 parts, circled some things because this was, in her paper, really her main points. First, she talked about physical violence, then verbal, then emotional, and then she talked about government programs as a whole, and then she talked about how they were changing to help victims and perpetrators. So those were her 5 or 6 main points in her paper, and her revised introduction was much better and much more specific and much more interesting than her original. Let's take a look at one more. What not to do. This is about opioids. Should you do drugs? Nowadays, the society, mainly the youth, is getting addicted to drugs, alcohol, smoking, and many more. Most of the teenagers, even the school boys and girls, are taking drugs, some of them knowing and some without knowing the bad effects they get into these habits. Although drug is used for important medicine, but the illicit use of it damages human body part. This is illegal to take such drugs like heroin, cocaine, etc. Nicotine, the drug that makes tobacco addictive, goes to your brain very quickly. Moreover, it go through the bloodstream and make changes of human body parts, not only physically but also mentally. So here's the first thing. We have this drug is used. We have illicit. Somewhere there was nowadays is misspelled. There's like 5 or 6 grammar errors, and also I'm not sure what they mean about human body part. So when we have this, here it is, damages human body part. I use this as an example because this person did major rewrites for this paper, and her original version had tons of grammar errors, but there were other problems too. And I think a lot of times when I talk about papers, I will say, oh, you need to revise this, and people think, oh, I need to fix my grammar. But really, grammar is just one piece of the puzzle, and you need to look at also structure, organization, support, all of those other kind of things that I grade you on. You know, the last one didn't have any real problems with grammar, but it did have problems with support and organization and having an announcement, so formal tone and that kind of thing. So ignoring her grammar, what else went wrong? Should you do drugs? I don't want you to start with a question. Also, it's a ridiculous question to ask. Yes, that's true. So a lot of times in high school and even in middle school before that, teachers will talk about writing a thesis question. And people in college, a lot of times will have a thesis question. But a thesis question is really done before you write. So I have a question like, how can we best prevent domestic violence? And then I go and do research and try to answer that question, right? It's really a question that is used to guide my research. But it's not appropriate in your paper to have it, because by the time you write your paper, you need to have a thesis that makes a statement, because you've already discovered the answers to the questions that you're asking. The other problem with this is that it's what's called rhetorical. Rhetorical question means that it's not supposed to be answered. That is extremely annoying, because in a paper, I can't answer you at all. Should I do drugs? What kind of drugs are you talking about? Are you talking about marijuana, where there's an actual, controversy over whether or not people should be allowed to do it? Are you talking about prescription drugs that I might actually need in my life? You don't know what my life might be like. You don't know what somebody else's life might be like. And also, this is very informal. So it's more like a conversation as opposed to an essay. So I want you to stay away from questions. Here's her second point. Nowadays, the society, mainly the youth, is getting addicted to drugs. Well, first of all, we have very unsubstantiated statements here. It's a horrible example because it gives you a lot of explanation and there's no evidence. Watch out for stereotypes like these, and as I said, the grammar has problems. But mainly the youth is getting addicted to drugs. How do you know that the youth is getting addicted to drugs? Do I have a quotation there from an expert telling me that? Do I have a statistic showing that it's rising? No, I don't have any of that, so it's not substantial. She has the fact that illicit drugs are harmful, and I would expect the rest of the paper might be about that, but then she has this thing about nicotine, and this is actually one of the reasons I use this as an example. Nicotine being addictive is a smaller supporting detail. Her whole paper was not about nicotine, right? So really, she could have had this supporting detail as one of the topic sentence for a body paragraph if she cleaned up the grammar and the spelling, but it did not fit in her introduction at all. So after this, she kind of revised it. Here's what she said instead. When I was a teenager, I experimented with illegal drugs. I realized later that using drugs was a way to self-medicate and escape a horrible home life and the depression I was suffering from. I gotta say, too, also, I cleaned up the grammar for you guys because it still had some issues, but that's okay. Now, though, it's first person, but it's a hook that draws you in. And as I said, it's fine to have first person just in your hook. We have here some really interesting personal experience. And this is for her informative essay. So she's not actually going to be talking about how it's not a personal narrative where she's going to tell you her whole story, right? She's just using a little bit of personal experience to kind of get you into the topic. Then she says this. I was not alone. Studies have shown that 20% of young people who experiment with drugs do so because they're suffering from depression. Now, this is quite a bit more specific than nowadays some young people do drugs, right? We have a specific number of people, and the fact that they experiment with drugs because they have depression, just like she did. It's almost like another hook, but it kind of goes into her next point of her topic. In order to prevent addiction and overdose, this is her topic as a whole, prevention, Politicians and psychologists are beginning to examine the causes of drug abuse, including mental illness, trauma, abuse, and family instability. So now I have those 4 main points. I know from reading that introduction that that's what the rest of the paper is going to focus on. So we don't have any weird thing about nicotine. I know now that we're really going to look at the causes and how people are trying to prevent the addiction from occurring. It's not persuasive, really, and there's no loaded language. So it's quite a bit better. After the introduction, what do we have? Body paragraphs. Now I have this cute little picture here for kind of some younger kids, but it's basically very similar, right? If you have just one body paragraph, you have a closing sentence. For us, we don't. For us, we have the Peel method. So you make your point, or you write a topic sentence, you do your evidence, you explain or analyze, and then you link or transition to your next point. I really would like you to have one fact, statistic, quotation, summary, or paraphrase per paragraph. Sometimes, and if you look at the sample papers, some of those have more than one statistic or paraphrase. If it's from the same source, it's kind of okay, or if the two things are directly related. So let's say that source 1 tells me 20% of kids who experiment with drugs have depression. Source 2 tells me that 10% of kids who experiment with drugs have bipolar disorder. Those two things are directly related. So I would want to combine those two facts together. But for the most part, if you have more than one fact, statistic, summary, paraphrase, you're going to really have too much information in that paragraph, and you're not going to have enough room to explain it. I will say too that for this essay, you are going to have, for this Peel method, just kind of by default, a little bit more of the evidence than the explanation. Just because you're not trying to persuade people, so you don't need to interpret it or spin it for them. In a longer essay, you have to have sections for each one of your main ideas. So I say this because a lot of people come out of a type of writing where they have like a 5-paragraph essay. They have an introduction, they have 3 body paragraphs, and they have a conclusion. For my course, you're going to be writing things that are maybe 4 or 5 pages long, so you cannot have those things be just 1 paragraph each. For example, the person I just showed you who wrote about opioids, she had 2 paragraphs about mental illness and then 3 paragraphs about trauma. And that way, it's more like a section of your paper and not just 1 paragraph. You have to use transitions to move from one point to the next. The sample papers are really good examples of how to not transition for most of them. And for a couple of them, a couple of the transitions are quite good, but I think both of them struggled a bit with transitions. So also look at the pages I have linked for you guys about how to transition. So, body paragraph, what not to do. What not to do. So here's our example. There are many women out there who have been charged with and found guilty of abuse in an intimate relationship. There are countless cases where police are called to a couple's home because the woman has been abusing and hitting their husband or boyfriend. So I'm not going to read the whole thing again because we're going to go through it point by point. But what's missing? Here we don't have any evidence. I'm sorry, guys. We don't have any evidence. There we go. Got it to blink finally. We have a lot of explanation, but no, if you notice, there's no citation, there's no quote, there's no fact, there's no statistic. The thing that this person has done really well, actually, is they make their point and they're kind of explaining it, and they don't have any type of interpretation that's persuasive. So that's good. But here's the revision. There are many women out there who have been charged and found guilty of abuse in in an intimate relationship, abusing and hitting their husband or boyfriend. Then we have our evidence. So we have the P part, we've made our point, now we have E for evidence. For example, Mitch Hassel describes an incident between Mary and John Haggerty. In this case, Mary abused methamphetamines. She attacked John with a knife. However, Hassel explains, police did not require Mary to leave the home. They assumed her husband had incited the incident and took him away in handcuffs. I have the author's name right here and the page or the paragraph number here. So I don't, because this is here, I don't need to have Hassel again in the citation. But you notice that this is much more interesting than the paragraph we had before. And now we have a little bit of explanation. There was more, but just for our purposes, I've kind of cut it a little bit. This incident demonstrates the need for education for law enforcement officers. These officers believed Mary was defending herself. In reality, she was the perpetrator. So it's much more interesting. It's much better supported point because we have the evidence. Paragraph 2, what not to do. This is from our other essay from before. Opioid addiction has several causes. According to Dr. Stephen Hughes, quote, opioid drugs alter your brain by creating artificial endorphins. And then he continues talking until we have our citation, and we have his last name here. So they've cited it correctly. They have the transition or the topic sentence rather here. But what is missing? Well, here we don't have any explanation. We're missing the explanation. It's kind of the opposite problem that the other person had. So here's the revision. Here, opioid addiction has several causes. That's the topic sentence or the P for point. According to Dr. Stephen Hughes, opioids can change a person's brain chemistry by, quote, creating artificial endorphins. What I like here is that they kind of paraphrase this and then they have a shorter quote, which is really nice. So that's our evidence. Hughes continues to show that once people start using opioids, they cannot produce their own endorphins. Continuing on with that evidence. And then she has the explanation. Therefore, people become physically addicted to drugs because they want to continue feeling the rush of endorphins. Their brains crave the high but cannot produce it through normal life experiences. Great! Again, much better. And here comes our link. Brain chemistry is just one component of addiction. Another cause of physical addiction is... And then she continued on. This is a good transition because it talked about the first topic, brain chemistry, and then another cause of physical addiction. So she repeated kind of what she had just stated, and then she mentions what she's going to be talking about in the next paragraph. Much more clear than the original. So make sure, again, have that balance. The first one had explanation with no evidence. The second one had evidence with no explanation. When you have a better balance, it becomes easier to read and it's more interesting and it shows that you understand the material and you can explain it. So what do you include in your conclusion? Again, as I said before, you are the expert. Because informative essays are teaching somebody else about your topic, you have to filter and boil that down. So I want you for this type of essay to do a summary paragraph. It's not a copy and paste of your introduction, but instead you're taking all the main ideas from your paper and you're restating. So it's new words, not new ideas. You don't want to throw in a new quotation that I've never seen before or a fact or statistic that should have been in the body of your paper. You also don't want to redo your introduction. I find a lot of times, again, that sometimes in high school, people tell you to restate your thesis, and sometimes either teachers aren't teaching that quite the right way or students kind of get confused. So it's not copying and pasting your thesis statement. That's not what you're doing. But what you should be doing is recapping those main points that were in your article or in your essay. So, what not to do? Going to university or college is a fresh start and a new way of life, and this is your chance to start your life in a positive, healthy way. You will have to take the first step to your fitness. All the best. And you can tell that last is very informal. This was her original draft. So what's missing? Here's my question to you as you're watching this. Can you tell what the topic was for this essay? It was actually quite confusing to me. This is a persuasive conclusion as well, calling people to do something. And lastly, we have this new idea about fitness. So one of our papers was about domestic violence. One was about opioids. It's not really clear what this is about. It looks like it's about going to college and not gaining that freshman 15. So actually, this is from the opioid paper. And here is her revision. Again, because she changed so much of her paper, her conclusion was quite a bit different. Mental illness can lead to drug addiction because many people try to self-medicate and do not seek help for their problems. Other people become addicted because they have experienced trauma, such as losing a loved one or being physically or sexually abused. Family instability, including the loss of a parent, an addicted parent, or a divorce, can cause people to turn to drugs. High school programs combining therapy and education can help prevent addiction. Now I have the 5 main points that were in her essay recapped. It would have been better here if she had had a transition is kind of missing at the beginning of this, or a link from the previous points, or even saying in conclusion would have been fine. But it is much more clear than was before. And she talks about mental illness, trauma, abuse, family instability, and the programs to prevent addiction and to treat it. So all of the main points are summarized there. And we don't have some weird statement about getting fit and getting off drugs before you go to college. Conclusion paragraph 2, what not to do. So this was from the paper about domestic violence. Even though many women do commit domestic violence, most perpetrators are still men. So in conclusion, we need to have education about women perpetrators, but also resources for women victims, because most victims are in fact women. Besides some of the grammar problems here, what's wrong? Well, the essay, as you could probably see from the body paragraph in the introduction, was really about women who commit domestic violence crimes. But we have really a vague statement here, and it undercuts, it might be true most victims are in fact women, but it undercut the author's entire paper. So here is our revision. In conclusion, we have this nice transitional linking words. Because women who commit domestic violence were often abused as children, treatment for these perpetrators often focuses on talk therapy and medication and help to deal with past trauma. Politicians have focused on providing shelter for female victims of domestic violence, but as more politicians and law enforcement agencies are educated about male victims of domestic violence, programs are being created for men as well. Sorry, I tripped over my words there. I've been talking for quite a long time. The essay was about women who committed domestic violence. So we have the transition. It talked about the reasons for women being abused as children, treatment, talk therapy, medication, and help. And then so those were kind of a larger section, right? 3 paragraphs for that topic. Then it talked about politicians and the programs that exist, and then new programs. So all of the author's main points here are covered, and it's a lot more clear than what he had before. In conclusion, so open your essay with a hook that captures the reader's attention. Avoid making stereotypical or vague statements. Don't do questions or dictionary definitions either. Don't use a question or an announcement. Use formal academic third-person language. Make sure that you have more than one paragraph for each of your main points. For each paragraph, make sure you have a clear topic statement, a piece of evidence, an explanation or analysis for that evidence, and also make sure that you use transitions. And conclude your essay with a summary paragraph that revisits all the main points, kind of like I've done for you here. That's it, everybody. I really look forward to reading your informative essays. I think you're going to find a lot of interesting information. And if you have any problems, again, you can come to me during office hours. You can also go to the writing lab, or you can get help at the library. Have a great day.